All right, let's get ready for another deep dive. And this time we're going high in the sky into the world of flying.
Sounds fun.
Yeah, we're looking at excerpts from the Airplane Flying Handbook, Chapter 3, on basic flight maneuvers.
The pilot's handbook.
Exactly.
Yeah, this chapter is all about the fundamental moves that make up pretty much everything pilots do when they're up in the air.
Okay, so think of it like this. If you want to know how a plane actually flies, you know how a pilot makes those smooth turns and climbs and descents,
Yeah.
well, this chapter, this is where it all begins.
Yeah, you really can't skip ahead.
You can't, can you?
It's kind of like learning your ABCs before you try and write, a novel or something.
Right.
You can't just jump to the complicated stuff.
So even the complex maneuvers, things like taking off and landing, those are all built from these basic maneuvers we're going to be talking about.
Absolutely, they're all combinations of these fundamentals.
That's really interesting.
It's like imagine trying to play a complex song on the piano, but you don't even know the basic scales. It
Right.
just wouldn't work.
Okay, so the handbook talks about this idea of feel in flying,
Yeah.
and it makes it sound like it's not just about looking at the instruments, it's about sensing how the aircraft is doing almost instinctively.
Yeah, yeah.
Is that what they mean by feel?
Yeah, you start to feel the plane through things like sound and vibrations, even the G-forces.
Mm.
It's how you kind of build up this feel for what the airplane is doing.
Wow, so it's like a sixth sense almost for pilots.
You could say that.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's all about kinesthesis and proprioception, picking up those subtle cues from the airplane.
It's kind of like, I guess, when you can tell that your car needs a tune-up just by the way that it sounds.
Right,
So
exactly.
the more you fly, the more you develop that intuitive sense of feel.
Exactly. It comes with practice and experience.
Okay, so we've got feel, which is all about intuition, and then the handbook also talks about something called attitude flying. And I'm wondering, is that something totally different?
It is related, but it's more about the plane's position relative to the horizon.
Okay.
So knowing if your nose is pointing up or down, if your wings are level, that sort of thing.
So, like, if you're tilted, how do you even know that? Is it visual, or is it all instrument?
Well, when you can see clearly outside, we call that visual meteorological conditions, or VMC, you can literally see where your wings are compared to the horizon.
Okay.
But, in cloudy conditions or instrument meteorological conditions, IMC,
Right.
you rely more on the instruments.
Oh, okay.
It's like using a map and compass versus
Mhm.
relying on landmarks when you're hiking.
Right. You use what's available.
Exactly.
But whether it's by sight or by instruments, you still have to be able to control the plane.
Right, of course.
So how do you do that?
Well, there are 4 key things pilots need to manage: pitch, bank, power, and trim.
Okay, let's break those down.
Right.
What exactly is pitch?
Well, think of it as the angle of the airplane's nose, whether it's pointing up or down, and you control it with the elevator, which is on the tail.
Uh-huh.
Pull back, the nose goes up; push forward, the nose goes down.
Okay, that one seems pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
What about bank? I always imagine that as like the most dramatic movement.
Yeah. Bank is the tilting of the wings, controlled by the ailerons.
Okay.
You move the control stick, left wing goes down; move it right wing goes down.
So that's what actually causes the plane to turn.
Exactly.
Okay, and power, that's just the engine.
Yeah, more power, more thrust from the engine, and generally, faster speeds.
Okay.
You can control that with the throttle.
All right, so we've got pitch for up and down, bank for tilting, power for speed. What's this last one? Trim.
Trim is kind of like a helper that takes some of the effort off your arms. Imagine holding your arm out straight for a long time.
Right.
It gets tiring.
Right.
Trim takes over some of that constant pressure you might need to hold on the controls.
So it's making it smoother for the pilot.
Exactly. And it allows for more precise control, especially during long flights.
Now, the handbook also mentions something called integrated flight instruction.
Yeah.
Is that just learning to fly by sight and by instruments?
Yeah. It's learning to use both at the same time.
Okay.
But the main focus is always on what you see outside, using the instruments to double check.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So your eyes are the primary source and the instruments are there to back you up.
Right, exactly.
What are some common mistakes that beginners make?
One of the biggest ones is staring at the instruments too much.
Okay.
You have to scan for traffic outside, not get glued to the dials.
Right.
And beginners also sometimes overcorrect, making jerky movements instead of smooth ones.
Okay, so smooth and steady, looking outside.
Yep,
Got it.
exactly.
All right, so let's zoom in on one of these basic maneuvers then, and that is straight and level flight.
Okay.
Sounds simple enough,
Yeah, it sounds simple.
but I bet there's more to it than meets the eye.
Oh, absolutely. Think about it. You need to maintain a specific heading and altitude.
Right.
And you're doing that by using visual references and constantly checking your instruments.
So do pilots use like specific parts of the airplane to line up with the horizon, like landmarks?
Yeah, they establish what we call reference points.
Okay. Yeah.
And it might be the top of the engine cowling or the wingtips.
Mm.
It all depends on the pilot's position in the cockpit.
Oh, interesting. So you're tailoring your view to your position.
Right. And pilots also cross-check the instruments like the attitude indicator and the heading indicator
All right.
just to make sure they're on track.
Yeah.
So like driving on a straight road, you're constantly making tiny adjustments to stay in your lane.
Right. So it's this constant process of adjusting and checking. Yeah.
Exactly.
But isn't straight flight just about keeping the wings level? Why is there all this talk about using the rudder too?
Well, the ailerons control the bank, the tilting of the wings, but the rudder controls yaw, which is the side-to-side movement of the nose. You have to use them together to keep the plane flying smoothly without any slipping or skidding.
You don't want to be fighting the plane. You want to be working with it.
Exactly. You have to move in harmony with the plane.
Like a dance partner.
Exactly.
Now, the handbook also stresses having a light touch on the controls, especially for level flight.
Right.
Why is that so important?
Well, it's about developing sensitivity, getting a feel for the plane.
Yeah.
You can't be ham-fisted.
Right.
It's like playing the piano. You need a delicate touch to get the nuances in control.
So finesse, not brute force when it comes to flying.
Exactly. Precisely.
How does a pilot actually do that then? Maintain that level flight?
Well, they start by choosing a visual reference point, usually toward the front of the plane, and keep it aligned with the horizon.
Okay.
And then they use the elevator to make little adjustments to the nose to stay level.
And they're checking the altimeter to make sure that they're at the right altitude.
Right. It's all about looking outside, verifying with the instruments, making those small corrections.
So it's that feedback loop.
It's exactly.
Constantly adjusting.
Yeah,
And we talked about trim a little earlier. Does that come into play with level flight?
absolutely. Once you've got the plane level, you use the trim to take over some of the effort, so you're not constantly holding pressure on the control stick.
So it's the airplane's version of cruise control?
Exactly.
Makes it easier to stay on track?
It makes level flight a lot smoother and less tiring for the pilot.
Now, I know there must be some common errors that pilots make, even with something as, quote, basic as level flight. So what are some things to look out for?
One mistake is fixating on the nose of the plane to judge if you're level.
Okay.
You want to focus on the wingtips. They give you a longer reference line and make deviations more obvious.
Okay, so choosing the right visual cues is important.
Right.
What else?
Another mistake is over-controlling, making big, jerky movements instead of smooth ones.
Right. Smooth and subtle.
Exactly. Remember we talked about that light touch?
Yeah. And obviously getting too focused on the instruments and forgetting to look outside, that's a big problem too.
Absolutely. Instruments are important for verification, but your eyes should be your primary source of information.
Okay, good advice.
Yep.
Now let's move on to another key maneuver, and that is turns.
Okay.
What are the basics of a smooth, coordinated turn? That's always when I feel like things get really interesting.
Well, a turn starts with banking the wings using the ailerons.
Okay.
And when you bank, the lift that's keeping the plane up gets kind of split into two components.
Okay.
One part keeps fighting gravity, and the other pulls the plane in the direction of the bank.
So it's the bank that actually makes the turn. It's not like steering a car. It's more like leaning into a curve on a bicycle.
Exactly. You tilt the bike to make the turn.
Oh, that is kind of counterintuitive. I
Yeah.
always thought it was more like steering a car.
Yeah.
So if the ailerons make the bank, what does the rudder do during a turn?
As you bank, something called adverse yaw happens.
Oh.
It wants to push the nose of the plane in the opposite direction of your turn.
Oh.
So the rudder counteracts that, keeping the turn smooth.
So it's like a counterbalance.
Yeah, exactly.
And the elevator still controls the pitch, right?
Yes, the elevator is crucial for maintaining altitude during the turn. Because as you bank, you lose some of that lift that's fighting gravity, so you get to pull back a little on the elevator to compensate.
It's all about keeping the plane balanced during the turn.
Exactly.
So the handbook mentions different types of turns. Shallow, medium, and steep.
Yep.
What's the difference?
The difference is in the bank angle.
Okay.
Shallow turns have a small bank, medium turns have a bigger bank, and steep turns have the biggest bank angle.
So bigger bank equals a tighter turn?
Exactly.
Makes sense.
And as the bank gets steeper, the forces get stronger, so you need more back pressure on the elevator to keep from losing altitude.
Oh, so like taking a sharp curve in a car at high speeds,
Easy
you
to
really
land.
feel it. And it's those steeper turns where that coordination with the rudder, that's where it becomes super important.
Absolutely.
Okay, that's a great explanation of how turns work. So how does a pilot actually establish a turn? Like, what are the steps?
Well, first you have to decide how steep you want the bank to be.
Okay.
And in a lot of smaller planes, the pilot will use the top of the engine cowling as a reference point.
Okay.
Then they use the ailerons to smoothly roll the plane into that bank,
Okay.
coordinating with the rudder to avoid that adverse yaw we talked about.
Smooth and coordinated.
Exactly.
Got it. Then what?
Then it's all about maintaining that bank angle, adjusting the elevator to hold altitude, and keeping the turn coordinated with the rudder.
It sounds like a lot to manage.
It is. It's a lot like juggling.
Right.
Once you get the hang of it, it becomes second nature.
So practice makes perfect.
Yeah.
What are some common errors that pilots make when they're first learning to make turns?
One of the biggest ones is not checking your surroundings properly before you start the turn.
Oh, right.
You have to make sure there's nothing in your way.
Situational awareness.
Exactly.
What else?
Another common mistake is overusing the rudder.
Okay.
Remember, the rudder is there to coordinate the turn, not to force it.
Right, and not adjusting the elevator enough to keep the plane from dropping. That's got to be a common one.
Definitely.
Yeah.
You have to constantly be thinking about those forces we talked about.
Yeah. Well, that was a great breakdown of turns. Now I'm curious about climbs, especially climbing turns.
Okay.
What are some things to keep in mind when you're trying to climb smoothly and efficiently?
Well, a climb is essentially a controlled ascent where you gain altitude.
Okay.
To do that, you need more lift than the force of gravity pulling you down.
So how do you get more lift?
You increase the angle of attack of the wings, kind of like tilting them upwards.
Okay.
And to do that, you need to increase the pitch attitude of the plane, so you pull back on the elevator.
So you're tilting the plane up to create more lift.
Okay.
Exactly. What about power? Does that
Right.
matter during a climb?
Absolutely.
Okay.
You need to increase engine power to maintain your airspeed as you climb.
So it's like pedaling harder on a bike when you're going uphill?
Exactly. You need that extra power to overcome the drag and keep climbing.
Yeah, so it sounds like finding that balance between pitch and power and airspeed, that's key to a smooth climb.
Right. You don't want to stall or lose too much speed.
Now, the handbook mentions different types of climbs. Normal climb, best rate of climb, and best angle of climb.
Yeah.
What's the difference?
They all have to do with the airspeed you maintain during the climb and how that affects your climb performance.
Okay.
So normal climb, sometimes called a cruise climb, is done at a higher airspeed
Yeah.
and is best for, general climbing.
What about best rate of climb?
The best rate of climb is all about gaining altitude as quickly as possible.
Mhm.
It's like taking the express elevator up to altitude.
So when would you use that?
But usually right after takeoff to get to a safe altitude quickly.
Got it. So what's this last one? Best angle of climb.
Best angle of climb is all about clearing obstacles.
Mhm.
Think of it like this. You're climbing over a fence, so you need to climb steeply to clear it.
So you use best rate of climb when you want to get high quickly and best angle of climb when you have something you have to climb over.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
You choose the climb type based on what you need to achieve.
Okay, so let's talk about how you actually start a climb then.
Okay.
What are the steps?
Well, it starts with smoothly pulling back on the elevator to increase the pitch to the desired climb setting.
Okay.
At the same time, you increase engine power to maintain your airspeed.
Gotcha.
It's all about coordinating those inputs smoothly.
Smooth and coordinated. Got it.
Yeah.
And then what? You make small adjustments to the pitch to stay on target.
Exactly. You're constantly monitoring your airspeed and climb rate and making small adjustments to keep everything smooth.
And trim comes in handy here.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Once you've established your climb attitude and airspeed, you can use the trim to take over some of the back pressure you're holding on the elevator.
To trim is like that helping hand. Makes everything a little easier.
It makes the climb more comfortable and allows you to focus on other things.
No, I'm guessing there are things that can affect how well a plane climbs.
Yeah.
So what are some of the factors pilots have to think about?
Altitude is a big one. As you climb higher, the air gets thinner, and that affects engine power and propeller efficiency.
Okay.
So your climb rate is going to decrease as you get higher.
So it's like hiking up a mountain. It gets harder the higher you go.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And weight also plays a role. A heavier plane is going to climb slower than a lighter one.
Kind of like carrying a heavy backpack up that mountain.
Exactly.
And what about wind? Does that affect things?
Wind can definitely impact your climb.
Okay.
A headwind is going to slow you down while a tailwind will give you a boost.
Oh, okay.
It's like swimming with or against the current.
So wind can work for you or against you?
Exactly.
Okay, so pilots have to take all those factors into account when they're climbing. Now, what about climbing turns? Those sound like they could get tricky.
Yeah, they are.
What makes them so challenging?
It's basically combining a climb with a turn, which adds complexity.
Okay.
You have to manage altitude, airspeed, and the turn radius all at the same time.
Wow, that's a lot to juggle.
It is.
What are some of the things pilots need to be careful of when they're making those climbing turns?
Well, one thing is that you lose some lift when you bank the wings, just like in a regular turn.
Right.
So you have to pull back even more on the elevator to maintain altitude.
Oh, right. You have to compensate for that loss of lift.
Exactly.
And of course, good coordination between the ailerons and rudder is essential, right?
Absolutely. You don't want to be slipping or skidding through the air, especially during a climb.
And what about power? Do you need more power in a climbing turn?
Yes, you usually need to add a bit more power to counter the increased drag from the turn.
Okay, so it's all about managing power, pitch, bank, and rudder coordination all at the same time.
It is. It's a real test of piloting skills.
Yeah, it takes practice and precision to get it right.
Yeah.
Now, I'm sure pilots make mistakes when they're learning to climb and make those climbing turns. So what are some common ones to watch out for?
One mistake is getting too focused on the airspeed indicator. You can't just chase a number. You have to look at the overall picture of the climb.
So it's about understanding that bigger picture, not just focusing on one instrument.
Exactly. And another mistake is using too much forward pressure on the elevator when you're leveling off from a climb.
Oh.
It can make you lose altitude too quickly.
So smooth and gentle when transitioning from a climb back to level flight.
Right.
And of course, bad rudder coordination in a climbing turn is going to cause slipping or skidding, which we know is not good.
Exactly.
So coordination is key.
Yeah.
Well, that was a fascinating look at climbs. And climbing turns, now let's shift gears and talk about descents.
Okay.
Essentially the opposite of climbing, right?
Yeah, you could say that, but descending isn't as simple as just pointing the nose down.
I bet.
Yeah.
So what are the most important things to remember when you're making a descent?
You have to remember that as the plane descends, gravity is pulling it down, so its airspeed tends to increase.
Okay.
So you need to reduce power to keep from going too fast.
Kind of like coasting downhill on a bike. You don't have to pedal as hard.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And besides reducing power, you also use the pitch attitude to control how quickly you descend.
Okay, so lowering the nose makes you descend faster and raising it slows you down.
Precisely. And just like with climbing, it's a balance of pitch, power, and airspeed.
Okay, now the handbook talks about 3 different types of descents.
Yeah.
What are those?
The most common one is a partial power descent.
Okay.
That's what you use for, routine descents during a flight or when you're approaching for landing.
So that's like the everyday descent.
Exactly.
What about the other 2?
We also have descent at minimum safe airspeed, which is more for clearing obstacles on a short runway approach.
Okay.
And then there's the emergency descent, which is obviously for when things get serious.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I can see how that one would require some quick thinking and precise control.
Absolutely. It's a maneuver you hope you never need, but you have to be ready for it.
Well, that's a lot of information about descents already, and I know there's a lot more to talk about, but I think this is a good place to pause for now.
Okay.
We'll pick up where we left off in the next part. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into basic flight maneuvers. We'll be back soon to explore more of the fascinating world of flying.
Sounds good. So last time we were talking about descents, and I think we left off mentioning a glide, which always sounds so graceful, like a bird soaring through the air.
Yeah, it does.
So what exactly is a glide?
That's a great question.
Well, you're not too far off with that bird analogy.
Okay.
A glide is basically a controlled descent, but you're doing it with minimal or no engine power.
So it's like coasting downhill on a bike. You're not pedaling, but you're still moving forward.
Exactly. You're using gravity to keep moving forward, and you're balancing lift and drag to control how quickly you descend.
Okay, that makes sense. But why would a pilot ever need to glide? Isn't it better to have the engine running?
Well, there are a couple of reasons. For one, it's an important part of practicing those power-off landings we were talking about earlier.
Oh, okay.
It helps you develop really precise control.
I can see how that would be useful, especially if you ever had to land without engine power.
Exactly. And that's the other main reason for learning to glide. It's what you do if you have an engine failure.
Wow, that's a pretty important skill to have then.
It is.
So how do you know if you're gliding efficiently? Is there like some way to measure that?
There is. We use something called the glide ratio.
Okay.
It compares how far you travel forward to how much altitude you lose. So like a glide ratio of 10-to-1 means you can travel 10,000 feet forward for every 1,000 feet of altitude you lose.
Oh, okay. So a higher glide ratio means you can glide farther, which would be really important if you had an engine problem.
Exactly.
So what determines that ratio?
Well, it depends on a bunch of things. The design of the plane, the weight, even how well the pilot flies it.
Okay, so let's talk about technique then. What's the key to a good glide?
It all comes down to finding what we call the best glide speed.
Okay.
It's the speed that gives you the best lift-to-drag ratio, which basically means you're gliding as efficiently as possible.
So it's like finding that sweet spot where you're not losing altitude too quickly, but you're still moving forward.
Precisely. And you have to use small adjustments to the pitch to stay at that best glide speed, especially if there's wind.
Now, you mentioned weight earlier, and I was curious, does having a heavier load, does that affect how far you can glide?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Weight actually doesn't affect the angle of the glide as long as you're flying at the right speed.
Mm.
But a heavier plane will need to fly faster to achieve that same glide ratio as a lighter one.
So it's like carrying a heavy backpack on a bike. You have to pedal harder to keep up the same speed.
Exactly. And while weight doesn't change the glide angle, it does affect how quickly you descend. So a heavier plane will come down faster than a lighter one, meaning it'll cover the same distance in less time.
Oh, interesting. So it's all about understanding those subtle relationships between weight, speed, and how quickly you're coming down.
Yeah.
Okay, well, what about wind? I know wind can have a big effect on how a plane flies. Does it matter when you're gliding?
Oh, absolutely. Wind can be a huge factor in how far you can glide. A tailwind, one that's blowing in the same direction as your glide, will increase your ground speed and help you glide farther.
Okay.
A headwind, on the other hand, will slow you down and reduce your gliding distance.
So wind can work for you or against you, kind of like a current when you're swimming.
Exactly.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned earlier that pilots have to adjust for things like P factor and torque when the engine's running.
Right.
Do those things matter when you're gliding?
That's a great point. They actually don't affect you in a glide because the engine's not running.
Yeah.
But here's the funny thing.
Okay.
The plane is designed to compensate for those effects when the engine is running.
So when you're gliding, you have to adjust for the lack of those forces.
It's like your brain is used to doing this little dance to balance everything.
Right.
And then suddenly the music stops.
Wow.
You have to adapt to a whole new way of flying.
That's a great way to put it. So it sounds like transitioning between powered flight and gliding, that takes a lot of finesse.
It does.
So what are the steps for actually entering a glide?
Well, first, you reduce the engine power to idle
Okay.
and adjust the propeller, if you have one, to minimize drag.
Oh.
Then you use back pressure on the elevator to keep the plane from dropping as the airspeed slows down to that best glide speed we talked about.
So it's a gradual process, not just suddenly cutting the engine and diving.
Exactly. You want to keep things smooth and avoid any abrupt changes that could make the plane unstable.
And once you're at that best glide speed, you just focus on maintaining it.
Right. You'll be making small adjustments to the pitch to keep the speed where it needs to be, especially if there's any wind.
And once you've got the glide stabilized, is that where trim comes in again?
You know, trim is your friend in any phase of flight. Use it to relieve the pressure on the control stick so you can focus on things like navigating or looking for a place to land.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, what about turning while you're gliding? I know we talked about turns before, but are gliding turns different?
They are. It's a lot trickier because you're dealing with lower air speeds. So you have to be really precise with the controls to stay coordinated.
So it's even more of a balancing act than a regular turn.
Absolutely. One of the biggest challenges is that you're more likely to lose altitude and airspeed during a turn, especially if you bank too steeply or use too much rudder.
So precise control of the bank and rudder is even more critical in a gliding turn. Okay, what else do you need to be careful of?
You also have to make sure you're keeping enough back pressure on the elevator to avoid losing altitude or stalling.
So it sounds like you're managing a lot of things at once.
It's definitely a maneuver that takes practice and finesse.
Now, let's say you're gliding and it's time to return to level flight. How do you recover from a glide?
Well, it depends. If you're just practicing glides, you'd add power smoothly and gently raise the nose.
Okay.
But if you're gliding because of an engine failure, the focus is on finding a safe place to land and making a controlled touchdown.
So the recovery process is different depending on why you're gliding in the first place.
Right, but in either case, the key is to be smooth with those control inputs.
Right.
You don't want to do anything jerky that could upset the balance of the plane.
It seems like that's a recurring theme. Smooth and steady wins the race when it comes to flying.
It really does.
Now, we've talked about a lot of different maneuvers. Are there any common mistakes that pilots make when they're learning descents and glides?
Definitely one common error is forgetting to clear the area before starting a descent or a gliding turn. You always want to make sure there's nothing in your way, especially when you're closer to the ground.
So situational awareness is super important, even when you're focused on making a good descent.
It is.
Okay.
Another common mistake is getting fixated on the airspeed indicator during a glide.
Okay.
You have to remember to look outside and see what's going on around you, not just stare at the instruments.
Right, you have to keep that big picture in mind.
Exactly. And a lot of pilots overuse the rudder in gliding turns, which can make the glide less efficient and potentially lead to a loss of control.
So finesse over force again.
Exactly.
Anything else that tends to trip pilots up?
Another big one is not keeping enough back pressure on the elevator. Remember how we talked about compensating for the loss of lift during a turn?
Right.
Well, you need to do the same thing during a glide. Otherwise, you could lose altitude too quickly or even stall.
So maintaining that balance between lift and drag is key throughout the entire glide.
It is.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here with descents and glides.
We-
Is there anything else about these maneuvers that we haven't talked about yet?
You know, there is.
Yeah.
We've been talking a lot about the technical aspects,
Right.
but there's another side to it that's hard to explain, almost like an art form.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
What do you mean?
Well, when you're up in the air, it's not just about moving the controls, it's about feeling the plane, sensing the air, responding to those subtle changes.
So it's more than just technical skills. It's about developing that intuition and feel that we talked about earlier.
Exactly. It's about becoming one with the plane, almost like a dancer with their partner.
That's a beautiful way to put it. It sounds like mastering these maneuvers is as much about feeling as it is about knowing.
You said it's something that comes with experience and practice.
Yeah. Okay, well, this has been a fascinating look at descents and glides and all the complexities involved. I'm really starting to appreciate how much skill and finesse goes into flying a plane. What else do we need to cover in this deep dive? It really does sound like a whole other level to flying beyond just, knowing the technical stuff.
It is.
It's like an art form, as you said. But for now, I think let's wrap up our deep dive into Chapter 3 of the Airplane Flying Handbook. What are some of the key takeaways that stand out to you?
Well, for me, it's the way this chapter really emphasizes how everything in flying is connected. It's not just about knowing how to move the controls.
Right.
It's about understanding those forces, lift, drag, thrust, gravity,
Right.
and how they all work together.
Yeah, it's like you have to speak the language of physics to really get it.
Exactly. And you have to be able to translate those physics into, actual control inputs. And this chapter makes it clear that becoming a good pilot takes a lot of practice. You have to develop that feel for the airplane. Keep refining your technique.
So it's a constant learning process.
Absolutely. It's like any skill. The more you practice, the better you get.
Now, the handbook also talks a lot about situational awareness.
Yes.
Why is that so important?
Because you're not flying in a vacuum. You're sharing the airspace with other planes. You have to be aware of weather conditions. You need to be thinking ahead to what might happen next.
So it's not just about flying the plane, it's about flying it safely and responsibly.
Right. It's about thinking like a pilot, not just a stick and rudder operator.
Okay.
And that brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with.
Yeah, okay.
Imagine you're sitting in that pilot seat.
Okay.
You can feel the engine, you can feel the wind, you can see the world out there in front of you.
Right.
How does understanding these basic maneuvers, these fundamental forces, how does that change the way you see flying?
It makes you realize that it's not just about pointing the plane in a direction and going. It's about working with those forces of nature we talked about.
Exactly. It's about understanding the language of the sky, being in tune with it.
Wow, that's a great way to put it. This deep dive has really opened my eyes to the skill and artistry that goes into flying.
Yeah.
I'm kind of tempted to try out a flight simulator and put some of this knowledge to the test.
I definitely recommend it. It's a great way to experience what we've been talking about firsthand.
Well, that's all the time we have for this deep dive into basic flight maneuvers. Thanks for joining us, and we hope you learned something new about the fascinating world of flying.
Until next time, blue skies and tailwinds.